I think it's off. I unplugged it.
All right, thank you everybody. I appreciate all having me. I'm Colin. I've been going to Fremont for 8 or 9 years now, so been a hot minute, and it's good to see some familiar faces. So I'm going to be giving a presentation. I noticed this is, I've listened in on some of the EPICC seminars, so I know they go a little long, but I'll promise not to bore y'all, so we'll keep it moving. I've got a lot of slides to get through, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to stop me. Depending on where it's going, I might ask to wait till the end. That way we can make sure we get through the whole presentation and everyone has a chance to have their questions answered. So, and really what I'm focusing on, I'm gonna start a little bit talking about myself, but I'm really gonna get into how do we talk about immigration, which is everybody's favorite topic, I know, but from a biblical, very just rooted, open-minded, but also practical approach. So a little bit about myself. Like I said, I've been going to Fremont for a long time, since I was a freshman at Sac State back in 2016, graduated in the class of 2020. Work-wise, I've floated around a bit. For a few years, I worked in local government for a prominent former elected official. That was a good experience, but the challenge with politics at any level is you have to be very much in line with what your boss stands for. And in our current political climate, as a Christian, trying to navigate that's a very difficult thing to do. And it was a difficult thing for me to do. So I'm still on great terms with my former boss and my colleagues, but I decided transitioning out of politics was probably the right thing to do long term, to be able to use my skills for good, but also to maintain the integrity of my faith. So what happened was, for a minute, I had some money saved up, and so I actually took a step back professionally. I went from being the mayor's intern coordinator to being an unpaid intern at World Relief. And I figured that if I just worked hard enough, eventually a job opportunity would open up, and it did. And I've been grateful to work there. It's a good organization, Christian, loves the church, loves refugees, and so it's a privilege to be able to work there every day. So a little bit about World Relief as an organization. Nationally, we've been around for 80 years. We have offices across the United States and then also overseas doing other human development work. And then here in Sacramento, we've been around for 36 years. Our mission and vision. So our mission is to boldly engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church. And then our vision is that we envision thriving, welcoming communities where families flourish and people experience restorative relationships with God, their neighbors, themselves, and all creation. So by the numbers, our office alone has settled, the number here is 34,000. I think it's actually closer to 40,000 since the late 80s. Sacramento is interesting because if you look, the federal government decides where refugee families are placed throughout the country. And for whatever reason, Sacramento gets a disproportionately high number of refugees, or at least before the recent policy changes. So just to kind of put in perspective, Sacramento last fiscal year, our office resettled about 1,700 individuals. Around this time last year, I was on the phone with a colleague from our Chicago office, and he told me that they only resettled about 500 people. So, you have multiple offices in that area, but it's still interesting that you compare the Sacramento metropolitan area to Chicago. It's not proportionate, and yet we're putting out some pretty insane numbers. So I couldn't tell you why Sacramento is so popular for refugee resettlement, but it is. And that's something in my mind to be proud of. So I've talked a little bit about the numbers. About 1,700 people were resettled last fiscal year. But beyond that, there's a lot of other people that receive supportive services like job support, getting an education, English as a second language classes, wellness programs, depending on what they're trying to do, like if they're pursuing citizenship, immigration legal services. So doing a lot of good work. What we're going to be talking about today, really starting off with what does the Bible say about immigration and governance, right? Looking at that tension. Looking at refugees and how do they compare to other types of immigrants that come to this country. And then looking at some of the data about refugees, like where are they coming from in the world? And then looking at refugee admissions. And there's a bit of a caveat because a lot changed starting in January and going forward. So looking at how it used to work and how it's working now. And where it's heading, I couldn't really tell you, but we'll go with that. And then also kind of looking at why refugee admissions matters. And really diving deeper than just, it's just helping people. But why does it matter to the church? And why does it matter to our country? Going over some statistics that come up with immigration, even some of the harder ones we don't really want to talk about, right? Some of the, we're not going to necessarily shy away from some of the controversial parts of it. Obviously, we're not going to make a huge deal out of it. That's not the focus of my talk, but I also don't think it's fair to talk about immigration and not acknowledge some of the legitimate concerns that people have about our immigration system. It's going to get really interesting is when we give policy recommendations for you guys to consider. Not necessarily here to tell you who to vote for, nothing like that. It's just World Relief stances that we are political, but we are nonpartisan. So we don't endorse parties, we don't tell you who to vote for and who to not to vote for, but we engage both sides of the aisle and we try to put forth good faith policy recommendations that are rooted in data and really have the church's best interests at heart. And then lastly, we're going to talk briefly about how do Christians get involved? How do we engage in a way that's productive? And then I'll have whatever time we have left, I will take questions. So a few things to note, and I've already hit on some of these. So this is a faith-based, this is a Christ-based presentation. It's not partisan, and it's an overview. It's a very complicated issue. There's a reason where if you have to deal with anything in our immigration system, you hire a lawyer, because it's not easy to figure out. I am not an attorney, so I'm not qualified to speak on that way. I'm not qualified to give anyone legal advice. So I will say this, if you know somebody who is an immigrant and has some concerns about their immigration status, anything like that, they really need to consult with an immigration attorney. Because I'm representing my organization, I'm not just going to be popping off about my personal political opinions. I'm keeping that to myself. I'm really going to be sticking to the talking points that our advocacy team has put together based on their own research and direct outreach, that kind of thing. So I am going to focus mainly on refugees because that is the primary demographic that World Relief Sacramento serves. I will touch on some of the other immigration statuses and the border a little bit because it is relevant to a degree, but I'm not going to fixate on that. And then the last thing I want to say is you can walk out of this conversation and say, I don't agree with a single thing he said, and we can still be my brother or sister in Christ. That's not what matters here. So I don't want to give the impression that the views that I express here must be the views held by all Christians on immigration policy. It's just my perspective based on the research and my work experience and the people I work with. So I have some scripture. Would anyone like to take this verse, please? Go ahead, Linda.
From Leviticus, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Thank you. All right, does anyone want to take the next one?
For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Matthew 25, 35, 36.
Thank you. So there's some other, so I want to bring up this tension that exists when we talk about immigration, right? On one hand, as Christians, we have a calling to love people and to love the vulnerable, and this is those verses we're talking about. We are also called to be good citizens, to obey the rule of law, to want what is best for our country. And does anyone want to take these verses? Go ahead.
For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes. For the authority are God's servants who give their full time to govern you. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Romans 13:4-7. Then Jesus said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And they were amazed at him. Mark 12:17.
Thank you. And there's some other examples of when biblical figures had some kind of relationship to the government, right? We think of Joseph and Pharaoh and how he helped prevent the famine, or he helped prepare Egypt for the famine. Daniel and his relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. And then I even include when in Acts when Philip met the Ethiopian eunuch and then presented or helped him understand the book of Isaiah and baptized him. Right? So what this shows is that as believers, we do have an obligation to our government. We also have an obligation to be good citizens. We have an obligation to obey the law. We have an obligation to want the well-being of our leaders, even if we don't agree with what they always do. We have to care for them and want what's best for them and want them to discern what is best and what is right in the eyes of God. So we live in that tension where we balance both interests. And oftentimes what I hear a lot in just conversations with people I know is that a lot of people feel that those are inherently competing interests. You either help people and you bring people into this country and you give them a leg up at the cost of Americans. You either do that or you protect your borders. You protect American jobs, whatever, right? You choose what is best for America first. So I think there's just in the public discourse, there's this perception that you're either picking one or the other. I'm going to argue that you can actually have both. It's not easy. If there was an easy solution, we would have figured it out by now. Obviously, there isn't. Not everyone comes to the same conclusion here. But I want to argue that there is a middle ground where we can be humanitarian and we can also want what is best for our country. I really like this quote from Tim Keller, late pastor Tim Keller, when he talks about doing justice not only includes righting wrongs, but generosity and social concern, especially towards the poor and the vulnerable. It consists of a broad range of activities, from simple and honest dealings with people in your daily life, to regular, radically generous giving of your time and resources, to activism that seeks to end particular forms of injustice, violence, and oppression. So in this next section, we're going to look at the refugee experience, where they come from, how many, that kind of thing. So first we want to start off with who is a refugee, and that's important because there's a lot of different types of refugees or immigrants, and refugee is a term that gets kind of thrown around interchangeably with a lot of other immigrant statuses, and that's important for what we're talking about because let's say you meet someone who immigrated here from Afghanistan. If they have refugee status, that says certain things about how long they're allowed to stay in the country, what services they're eligible for, and their pathway to citizenship. Someone can come from a very similar background, but let's say if they were processed in at the Mexican border, they might be coming here as an asylum seeker, which means that their legal status is completely different and the services they're eligible for are different. So it's important to make that distinguish that. So a refugee is a person who's fled their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or affiliation with a social group.
Or gender.
Yes, or gender. So there's some other types of immigrants. So you have asylum seekers. So that is someone who has similar grounds for wanting to flee their home country, But instead of going through a refugee screening process that we'll talk about later, they show up at a port of entry of a country and then request to be processed in as an asylum seeker. And then the United States has a process for handling those kind of cases. But what happens is, if they come in that, then they have to wait, and then a judge decides whether or not they're allowed to stay and can grant them asylum or not. You also have special immigrant visas. So SIVs are almost identical to refugee status, very similar, but it's a special status that's designated for primarily Afghans who helped the United States during the war. So the ones that I've met were either interpreters for the military. A lot of them were also guards at the embassy in Kabul. So it's kind of a mix, but they get this special status because of their association with the United States government and specifically the United States military. You also have humanitarian parole and something that's similar to that called temporary protected status, which is it's a temporary status that the government can grant at their discretion, and it's usually for short periods of time. So like say half a year and a half, that kind of thing. And it changes. I know with Afghan TPS, there's plans to have that taken away, which is unfortunate. But like, for example, an example of humanitarian parole is when the war in Ukraine broke out. You had a bunch of Ukrainians that were leaving, and because of the situation, they didn't have time to go and wait however many years it takes to get processed in as a refugee. So they showed up at the Mexican border and then were processed in there. And so what happened was CBP processed them in on what's called humanitarian parole, which is a temporary status that allowed them to either stay for a time, leave, or figure out another legal pathway to residence. So there's that. Numbers wise, you have about 68 million people that are internally displaced in the world. So that internal displacement, taking Ukraine again as an example, that's like most of the fighting in the Ukraine war is happening in eastern Ukraine, right? But western Ukraine is mostly stable and is pretty safe for the most part. So you have a lot of Ukrainians that didn't want to leave Ukraine. So they went from, if they were living in the east, they moved west, but they never actually left their country. So that's an example of internal displacement. You have about 8 million people that are asylum seekers. That's a process I was just talking about. And the vast majority of them are going to be going through the US-Mexican border. There's other countries too, but that's mainly a United States issue. Just shy of 38 million are refugees. So what's interesting, like I said, if you look at the numbers, that red line, that's asylum seekers. Obviously, the US-Mexican border. Germany and Turkey actually take the most amount of refugees, and they put them in camps. Well, I don't know. I don't think the Germans actually use military barracks. Every country kind of takes refugees, has their own system. But for whatever reason, Turkey disproportionately takes the most amount of refugees in the world. And this is from the UNHCR, UN High Commission on Refugees. So here's the crazy thing. On average, a family lives in a refugee camp for 10 to 15 years. I met a family that immigrated here from Zambia on refugee status. And the family was originally Congolese, but then they got into a refugee camp in Zambia, and they were in that camp for 30 years. So their kids, their eldest son was like 21, and their youngest child, she was 16. So if they're in a camp for that long, the kids don't know anything other. That's where they grew up. They don't know anything other than the camp. So that's a tough thing. And it was interesting talking about that family, because when I was up in Chico, in the apartment that we put them in, large family in this very small apartment, and I was talking with the sons who were like 18 and 21, and I was asking them, well, what do you do for fun? And it was interesting because one of the sons, he replied, he said, oh, I don't care about hobbies. I need to get work. I need to provide for my family. Like, I don't know about you, but what 18-year-old says, I don't have hobbies, I just need to work? It's a very different perspective coming from a place of hardship and necessity. So I want to put that in perspective because as we go through the data, it's important to recognize it represents real people who have stories and have been through very hard things in life. This is interesting. So this was a painting from the UN High Commission on Refugees. UNHCR has an art gallery of art made by refugees depicting their experience. So this gentleman was from Ecuador, and this is his piece. And something I want to point out that's kind of interesting. Obviously, you can tell he's leaving parts of himself behind. But that blue duffel bag he's carrying, that is a UN-issued duffel bag. And so, unfortunately, because we don't have arrivals anymore, you can't pick people up from the airport anymore. But Linda knows that we did quite a few of them. And when you go and you pick up these families from the airport, the bags, they're heavy. They're like, I don't know, what, 40
to 50 pounds.
Yeah, they're big. And each adult gets about 2 a person. So when you pick up a family, yeah, they got a ton of bags. But then you realize what you are loading into, maybe 2 or 3 vans is an entire family of 6 or 7. It's all of their worldly possessions. It's all they have to start their lives over. So it's very powerful if you've experienced that, and I hope at some point folks will be able to come out and experience that again. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is what was the process of refugee resettlement. And it's weird because we've had some very drastic changes this year. So I'm talking about what has it historically been for the past few decades, and then what is it now. So starting with what it was. And some of this is still relevant to what happens now. So yet refugee admissions is completely under executive authority. So what happens is the President of the United States has something called the presidential determination. So every year, the President's advisors come to the President and give a recommendation on what they think should be the maximum amount of refugees allowed into the country every year. And they can also specify from what nations they think certain amounts should come from. So the thing is with the presidential determination is there is no ceiling or floor to it. It can be as little or as much as the president wants. What's interesting is if you look at the past few administrations, the numbers are kind of telling. So President Obama, throughout his 8 years in office, his numbers fluctuated between around 70,000 to around 80,000 a year. President Trump, in his first term, dropped it to about 50,000. President Biden, which was very unprecedented, shot it all the way up to 125,000. They opened it up to a lot of other nationalities that weren't as represented as much in the numbers as in previous administrations. Currently, President Trump has suspended refugee admissions through the State Department's Reception and Placement Program. So right now, nobody is coming in on refugee status. There are a few exceptions, but that's kind of rare, and we'll get into that. Some Afghans are still able to come, but it's a dicey situation. And then I know if you've been tracking the news recently, there's been some stuff about the Afrikaners that have been coming or coming recently, and I'm happy to get into that if you want, but that's not really something I'm going to touch on too much. So, how it normally works. Refugees are some of the most screened type of immigrant that ever come to the United States. They go through more security screening than most Americans ever will, more than I ever care to go through. They get screened by the FBI, Homeland Security, the State Department. CIA has some watch lists that they run them through. They have a medical screening, and then they get a cultural orientation, and after that, they were allowed to come to the United States. How it worked before was that World Relief was one of a handful of agencies that had a contract with the State Department to resettle these families. So they'd be split up across the United States. Usually, the main thing was if they had a relative in the United States that the government identified, they would place them in the vicinity of where their relative lives. Also, a lot of it is demographics. So because of the region in Sacramento, you get a lot of Afghans, a lot of Ukrainians, Russians, other former Soviet Union countries, Armenians, that kind of thing. So that's how they decided where people would go. When they got in the United States, they had a 90-day core service period. So that meant that someone would pick them up from the airport, and volunteers were often a big part of this. You'd have someone pick them up from the airport. We'd get them into housing that was secured for them. We'd maybe cover their first month of rent. And then have a caseworker that would meet with them pretty early on and start checking it out. Get the kids into school, help them get employment, get them into English classes, get them on medical, all that stuff. And they're eligible for certain support services that thankfully are still in place, like immigration legal services, employment services, some of the wellness and education classes, because those are funded through other government grants, and I'll get into that. But though refugees are eligible for those services up to 5 years post-entry. So this is a little bit of what we do. It's a little different right now because of recent policy changes, but more or less these are still a lot of the same services we still provide. So now getting into a little bit of the more challenging part, how are refugee services handled now? Immediately since the administration change, an executive order went into place doing a 90-day suspension. Those 90 days have passed and still much hasn't changed. What happened as a part of that was a stop work order. So all of the agencies, so not just us, but International Rescue Community, Opening Doors, all the resettlement agencies that had contracts with the State Department, they were told, wherever you are at, any expenses you incur, whether that's staff salaries, that's like housing payments, anything of that, it won't be reimbursed. So we had this situation where you had families that, here, I'll go a little out of order. So you had families, we had 115 families that when that order went into effect, they were somewhere in that 90-day service period, whether they were on the tail end of it or whether they literally just got off the plane. And a small chunk of those families were in a very bad situation where they were at risk of homelessness. So imagine coming to a country for your first time. It's scary enough knowing that you have all those services lined up for you. But coming to a country where strangers are picking you up from the airport, you've never been there, it's halfway across the world, maybe you speak the main language, maybe you don't, but you have to rebuild your life. That's a pretty terrifying experience already. On top of that, find out that promises were broken, and the people that were supposed to pick you up from the airport, and the caseworker that was supposed to get you into housing, and get your kids into school, and help you get a job, and get you doctor's appointments, that person is no longer employed, or they're not allowed to help you. That's scary. So we managed to make things work. We were able to get some of those families into transitional housing, but it was bad for a good chunk of time, and we lost a lot of fantastic employees that were doing good work just because of how that happened. And then the crazy thing is those are actually the lucky ones, because those are the ones that made it. Even under these horrible circumstances, they actually still made it. You had thousands of flights that were canceled, people that were in that pipeline waiting 2 to 4 years through a screening process to come to the States, and that was cut off. And so kind of to show on the government side how it breaks down, because it gets a little confusing, especially because of the Africanos. So normally, refugees would get processed, the admissions side, they get processed through the State Department, through PRM, Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And they had the reception and placement program. So that's where all those contracts were. And that's now suspended. On the other side, you do have federally funded refugee services that are still available, like our employment programs, wellness, education, things like that. And those are primarily for folks that are already here. And those services are still active, but that's because it's funded through an entirely different government, federal department. It's through Health and Human Services. Like I said, I won't get into the Afrikaners, but the reason why it's a little tricky is they're not reopening, to be clear, they're not reopening the State Department program to bring in Afrikaners. They're funneling them through existing programming through Health and Human Services, which makes things a little tricky for the organizations involved in this kind of work. So something that's pretty close to my heart, and I think that's sad, is how does this affect Afghan SIVs? So I mentioned earlier, Afghan SIVs are folks that have some kind of formal tie to the US military or the State Department. They helped us out in some way. Because of that, they're in danger. So I remember I was talking with one of our immigration attorneys, and she said that it's really hard to get an estimate on who's in hiding in Afghanistan, because they're in hiding, obviously. But our estimates range between 100,000 and 200,000 individuals are still in hiding in Afghanistan. The other thing that's challenging is the ones that have made it across the border. A lot of our Afghans, up until recently, would go to Pakistan if they could get across the border to Pakistan, and then could get processed through as a refugee from Pakistan. Right now, there's a lot of tension between the Pakistanis and Afghans, and so a lot of Afghan SIVs that are in Pakistan are now getting deported back to Afghanistan, where they face danger. And so these individuals are getting actively hunted down by the Taliban. The same immigration attorney I was talking to, she said it's not uncommon to hear stories of someone's relative got executed by the Taliban because they worked with the Americans. The other thing that's really sad is you have Afghan SIVs who are destroying their service records because they don't want, if they get stopped by the Taliban, they don't want anything tying them to the US. Challenge is that's kind of their ticket out. But it's really messy. So why did refugee admissions, and then I'm gonna start kind of branching out a little bit and going back to the broader other immigration things. Why does all of this matter to the church? So what's interesting is 86% of the immigrant population in North America are most likely either Christian or kind of close to becoming a Christian. It's disproportionate from the national average. So, we talk about, obviously we see that fewer young people are going to church in America. In North America, you hear the term post-Christendom being floated around, that not a lot of people are coming to church, but it's exploding in every other part of the world, right? And so what's interesting is you see that reflected in the American immigrant population. I heard when our VP of Advocacy came in town a while back to present, he told a really interesting story about, he met a Burmese pastor who said that he became a Christian when Christian missionaries came to Burma and witnessed to him. And then now he's coming to the because of the Civil War, he came to the United States as a refugee. And he said it's kind of weird that he was given the gospel by American missionaries, and now he's going to America to witness to Americans. So it kind of comes full circle. So a lot of asylum seekers, to that point, right, like the pastor from Burma, a lot of refugees and asylum seekers are Christian and are being persecuted because of their Christian faith. A very common example of this, one of our immigration attorneys was telling us, a type of case they see a lot for asylum seekers is Chinese international students. They come to the United States to get an education. Maybe they meet a Christian evangelist, or maybe they were already a Christian and just weren't open about it. But either way, they start openly expressing their Christian faith. And now there's a risk if they go home. So then they have to apply for asylum to stay in the United States permanently as an asylee. So all kinds of cases like that. So for us as Christians, keeping refugee admissions open, having an effective immigration policy is important, because if we want to protect our brothers and sisters that are persecuted around the world, historically this has been one of the best ways to do it. The other reason why it's important as believers is not just because of our Christian brothers and sisters, but because of the people who have yet to hear the gospel. So if we're talking like in the like Sacramento, for example, sure, you have Ukrainians and Russians, a lot of the Slavic nationalities that are typically, my experience, either like mainly Orthodox or Baptist, a lot of Baptist, Pentecostal, so some form of Christian. But on the other side, our Afghans population, I have yet to meet an Afghan Christian. I know they're out there, but they're exceedingly rare. Majority of our Afghan refugees are Muslim. Our Iraqi refugees, majority of them are Muslim. Iranian, majority Muslim. Not entirely, but majority. Syrians, same deal. So what's very unique about refugee admissions and Christians being involved in the work of refugee admissions is to some of these countries where you can't send Christian missionaries to Afghanistan, not openly at least. It'd be very dangerous to do so. A lot of these places where our missionaries cannot get to, people are coming here to us. It's a really beautiful thing. So for Christians to be involved in this work, to build friendships and real lasting connections with a lot of our refugee and immigrant neighbors that are not believers, this might be their first interaction with the Christian, or maybe their first positive interaction with the Christian. And that long-term relationship can go a long way. I have friends where they were on a good neighbor team, and they have a couple Syrian families that they helped out for a year. And to this day, years later, they're still friends with that family. That family comes over and celebrates birthdays or major milestones, if someone got a job or things like that. It's really sweet just to see them still doing life together. And I can't think in Syria of a normal situation in where a Muslim family would get that close with a Christian family. It's not something you would see, but that's the beauty of our country and what refugee admissions offers to our country and to the church. So why does immigration and refugee admissions matter to our country? Because we hear a lot, well, we gotta put Americans first. And I'll just be honest, one of the things I hear all the time, why are we spending resources helping refugees when we already have homeless people here in our neighborhood? I get it. I don't think there's an easy answer for that. But I'll throw out some stats to make a case. So from an economic standpoint, 45% of our Fortune 500 companies are founded by a refugee or an immigrant or a child of a refugee or an immigrant. 20 years after arrival, the average refugee adult has contributed approximately $21,000 more in taxes than they ever received in government aid. So, do refugees use up our social services? Initially, yes, but long-term, no. And so, immigration generally, just what, if you talk to economists, broadly what economists say is that immigration has a net positive impact on our economy. I have this last one here, it's a little smaller and I'm a little hesitant to bring it up because it's spicy, but I need y'all to bear with me. And I'm not drawing any conclusions about it yet. But also majority of economists also say that illegal immigration, I feel weird saying this, does actually have a net positive impact on the economy. And I want to be very clear, I am not advocating for illegal immigration. World Relief, we help legal immigrants and we do not encourage illegal immigration. We are not for that. We do believe in border security. We do believe that people need to be coming here the right way. That said, if you look at some of the economic realities, if you were to deport every single undocumented person in this country, our economy would fall apart. The reality is, and it's just what it is, a lot of our ag industry, hospitality, like the people that clean your hotels, the restaurant industry, there's a lot of construction, there's a lot of industries, think of the ones where you pay in cash. where if everyone that is not documented were to be deported by tomorrow, it would just fall apart. And it's not a moral statement, that's just the way it is. I'm not saying it's good either. I'm not saying we need to stay that way. Actually, World Relief doesn't want it to stay that way, right? But that's just the economic reality, is that you cannot just whisk everybody away like that and expect nothing for just business to go on as usual. And also the other reality, and I can say this for just immigrants in general, but I see this with the refugee clients that we work with. They're not taking the jobs that most Americans want to work. So what's interesting is, you get refugees where maybe they were a doctor in their home country. They can't just pick up and practice medicine here in the States. A lot of their licensing doesn't cross over in various professions. And the process to get relicensed in whatever you did in your home country in the States is not an easy thing. There's a gentleman I met that was an air traffic controller in Kabul, in the airport. And we were talking with him and he said, oh, there's an airport in Sacramento. They're just gonna hire me. No. One, because he has to get trained as an American. And the funny thing is, as an Afghan air traffic controller, he was probably trained on American systems. So there is that. But doesn't have the qualifications of an American air traffic controller. He doesn't have the professional experience of an American aircraft controller. He's not just gonna go walk over to Sacramento International and hand in a job application, right? That's not how it works. So we struggled with this gentleman to get him other work. And if you don't have a car, your first job, it doesn't matter what you did in your home country, your first job is, well, you can bike a few blocks to that McDonald's and work there. And so one of the things our employment specialists talk about is they're called ABC, a job, a better job, a career job. So for a lot of our refugee clients, regardless of where they were, they're starting from square one when they get to the States. What's ideal is if we can get them in employment that has some connection to their previous profession. So what we found is that a lot of our immigrants that would say if they had a medical experience, right now there's a lot of demand from ultrasound technicians. And that's a career pathway where the schooling isn't too long before you can start making decent money. And so for us, what our employment specialists do is they look at, okay, what is the talent pool we're bringing in through our refugees? Where are the needs in our workforce? What are jobs that are not being filled that need to be filled? And also, yes, we have a little bit of rent money to help them out from the start, but they got to start paying their own bills really quickly. So how can we get them into employment where they can become financially self-sufficient quickly? And depending on the family situation, that can be hard, right? A lot of our Afghan families are single income households. A lot of the mothers stay home and take care of the kids and manage the affairs at home. Well, the reality is, maybe they could afford to be a one-income household in Afghanistan. They can't afford to do that in California. So the mother, we might have to get her in ESL for pre-littered Afghan women, where she's learning just enough English that we can get her a job cleaning bed sheets at a hotel, that kind of thing. Just enough to bring in that supplemental income to make sure that they're breaking even every month. So another thing is, so when you're talking about immigration in the workforce, you're talking like skilled and unskilled labor, right? So unskilled, and I think that's a little derogatory in my opinion, because those people work their butts off, but they're the people harvesting the fields in like factory plants, that kind of thing. They're doing the dirty jobs that most Americans don't want to do if we don't have to. You also have really skilled labor, right? So like an example right now that's kind of poignant if you're looking at a foreign policy standpoint is Taiwanese engineers that can work on semiconductors. That's really important with everything that's going on with China and stuff. Being able to bring in foreign talent that is skilled is very important for our workforce and for our national interests. So I have an analogy that I like to use. I don't know if anyone here dabbles in sports at all. I do a little bit. I'm not super knowledgeable, but imagine you have two pro sports teams, Team A and Team B. They're exactly identical. The same roster, the same salary caps, same coaching staff, same general managers, everything. one Team A, the only changes they can make to their team are players that they bring up from their minor league affiliate or players they recruit from the draft. Team B can do the same thing. They can also trade players with other teams for players that they want, and they can sign free agents, and they can bring out an outside coaching staff that they can afford. Which team is going to be better? Obviously. Anyone that knows sports knows that's how it works. You don't have to be a sports nut to understand that. Is that a perfect analogy? No. But in general, historically, one of the advantages of the United States from a foreign policy standpoint is that we can bring in the best and brightest from other countries and have them work here. Is that everybody who's coming in? No. I get that. But the reality is we do have an advantage compared to countries like China and Russia that have very little immigration. They have to produce their own talent, and that's all they have. In the United States, we have homegrown talent, and then we can also bring in outside talent. And you know what that also does? That encourages Americans to work harder. If you're scared of an immigrant stealing your job, be more competitive. That's a very capitalist view, isn't it? So another thing that's interesting is going back to Afghan SIVs. One, we owe it to them. We would never leave our own service members behind in a foreign war zone. So why are we leaving our Afghan contractors behind? I know I'm a civilian, but for people I know that have served, that's a really touchy thing for them. It's something they're not happy about at all. The other thing that's bad about it, not just from a moral standpoint, not just from our country's honor, it's also bad because of what it signals to the rest of the world. Any future wars that the United States gets involved in, any diplomatic missions, anything, what we signal to the rest of the world is that if we go to war and you're a local of that country and you choose to side with the Americans, if things go south, we screw you over. That's what we signal. And that is dangerous. And that's actually the first Trump administration. That was one of the reasons that refugee admissions was kept open and wasn't shut down completely. Because a lot of President Trump's military and foreign policy advisors told him, you gotta keep this open to a degree. So that's how it survived the first time. Second time around, we don't know. But another thing too is that you have political dissidents in other countries that are speaking out against injustices in their country and are getting persecuted for it. We want to be able to have a place for them to go. That's part of, as we believe in freedom of speech and democracy and values that we hold true as Americans. When we see other people in other countries rising up and wanting that for their own countries, if they're going to be thrown in prison for it or killed for it, we want them to be able to come here and be safe and to be able to continue to speak freely for justice and equality. So, if it hasn't been spicy enough, we're going to get a little spicier. And we're just going to address some of the elephants in the room. Refugees and terrorism. You hear a lot with immigrants. It's like, okay, well, are immigrants safe? Are immigrants going to contribute to terrorism? Now, I talked about how refugees specifically are one of the most vetted immigrant populations our country takes. To this date, not a single refugee from the Middle East has been involved in a plot of Islamic terrorism against the United States. Not a single refugee. Want to get spicier? Immigration and crime. So these are crime stats from Texas. This is not a national statistic. I'm sure that if you looked hard enough, the Department of Justice has the uniform crime reporting it puts out every year. So I'm sure the DOJ probably has some national stats on this. But it's interesting because Texas is a good case study to look at because it's a border state. It's very large. So you see a lot. If you talk to people that work in law enforcement there, if you talk to anyone who's border patrol there, they've seen some stuff. But here's what's interesting. So if you look at their crime statistics that they put out, do immigrants commit crime? Legal and illegal immigrants. Do immigrants commit crime? Yes. But not as much as the general population. So that's an important thing to note. You hear a lot in the news about a horrific crime that happens, and it turns out that that person's an immigrant. I'm not going to try and hide that. You don't have to hide the ugly side of that to say I still generally support a humane and effective immigration policy. Bad stuff happens. But broadly speaking, majority of immigrants don't commit as much crime as the general population, whether they're documented or undocumented. And there's a reason for that. If as a US citizen, I'm an American citizen, if I'm convicted, if I commit a crime and then I'm charged, I have to go through the American criminal justice system. If I'm convicted, I face some kind of sentence, right? If you're an immigrant, you deal with the criminal justice side of things, and then you also have to go through immigration court. And even if you're a legal immigrant, depending on the nature of your conviction, you could lose your legal status. If you're undocumented, that might be one of the fastest ways you get thrown into deportation proceedings. So for immigrants, whether you're legal or illegal, committing crime has a much more serious implication for you than it does if you are a natural-born U.S. citizen. I guess with the driving statistics, I don't know what's up with that. So I won't say anything on that. But broadly, crime statistics, immigrants don't commit as much crime. So I want to make that clear. Drugs, as if we haven't gotten controversial enough. Fentanyl is a huge problem right now in the United States. It's killing our country. I don't want to downplay that. And I don't want to downplay the fact that the border isn't a problem. What's interesting statistically, though, is that majority of the people that get caught smuggling fentanyl across the border are not immigrants. They're US nationals. And the way our advocacy person explained this is the cartels recruit US nationals to do a lot of their drug muling because they're less likely to get caught. If you're a US citizen crossing a port of entry, you just have to not get caught bringing your illegal stuff across the border. If you're an illegal immigrant who is trying to cross the border, not at a port of entry, let's say, but like somewhere in a really dangerous spot in the middle of nowhere, if you get caught, you're immediately detained, right? So for them, just from a cost of doing business, it is more effective for them to recruit American citizens to smuggle fentanyl into the country than it is for them to have immigrant mules do it. Do they do? Yeah, they do. I mean, so it's both. I'm not saying, but more broadly, it's American citizens that are getting caught up doing this. So, and we're getting towards the end of my presentation, but something that I want to settle with. I don't want to just throw all these things at you and not give some solutions. And like I said, I'm not an immigration attorney. I'm not even an immigration expert. A lot of these things are way more complicated than what I'm going to cover in this presentation. There's a lot more nuance to it. But these are just overview ideas. And the big one is reopen refugee resettlement. Just full stop. Refugee resettlement has been around for decades. Both Democrat and Republican administrations have supported it. It's gotten bipartisan support from Congress throughout the years. It is not considered a controversial part of our immigration apparatus. And it does a lot of good for a lot of people. Even if it's less than 1% of the refugee population, right? Even at its peak, it wasn't actually taking that many people. But even still, even if you've won the geopolitical lottery and you get to come to the United States as a refugee, that changes your life and that changes your family's life forever. So we need to reopen it. We also need to bring back temporary protected status and humanitarian parole for some other vulnerable populations. So you might ask, well, why would Afghans be coming as refugees, but then also some of them coming as humanitarian parolees, right? And it depends, right? So in 2021, when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, some of the videos, if you've seen the videos, are awful. But you had families that got split apart. I mean, there were some families where they got on a plane And then their kids were waiting, and they said, okay, well, hey, we gotta go, they're gonna get on the next plane. And the next plane never came. That's something our immigration lawyers have been helping with a lot, it's family reunification. But you had some really bad situations where people were just whisked out of there. And because of that, they weren't gonna come to the United States as a refugee because they didn't have the time to go through that traditional process. So then they were processed in as either on temporary protected status or as a humanitarian parolee. Well, we've had a situation where a lot of Afghans that were on temporary protected status are now getting notices that they have to leave the country. To where? Right? That's a bad situation. How is it fair that they might have both been fleeing the violence of the Taliban, and because one has papers saying they're a refugee and one has papers saying that they're a humanitarian parolee or they're on TPS, that one gets to stay and the other has to go? It sucks. So there is a reason why those programs exist. Cases are needed. And one of the things our immigration lawyers do is they will help various immigrants like reclassify, right? So if someone came in on TPS, they'll help them with the legal work that might be what they need to be reclassified as a refugee. And then they get that permanent legal status. So, but I mean, I could go on and I won't, but there's just some wild stories that are really, really heartbreaking. And imagine if that was your family. We do need secure borders. World Relief is very firm on the fact that we do need secure borders. And it is within the government's right to secure its own borders and determine who comes in and out. Full stop. We do believe in that. We're not trying to argue for it otherwise. And sometimes we catch some flack for that we actually do believe in that. With deportations, you hear a lot about what's happening with the deportations. For us, what we have urged the government, specifically ICE, what we're calling on them to do is if they're going to deport people, to focus on folks that have serious criminal convictions. Focus on the guys like the MS-13 guys, the Tren de Aragua guys, right? The folks that are actively endangering our communities and are violent and are a threat. Not the guy who works at the taco stand down the street. All right, there's a difference. So that's our stance on when deportation should happen. We also believe that there should be a process for restitution and legalization of people that were brought here illegally, right? So specifically dreamers, so people that were brought here as children without any understanding of the legal system, and that they're just a kid. They don't know any better. They should not be penalized for that. We believe that there should be a bipartisan support for a pathway for legalization of dreamers. For folks that did come here as an adult, willingly, illegally, who maybe lived here for say, decades even, haven't been causing problems, trying to live an honest life, just aside from their immigration status, we should have a pathway for them to become legal, to have legal status. And we believe that there should be a restitution-based pathway where if they meet all these other eligibility requirements and they're willing to pay a very hefty fine, that they should have a pathway to legalize. So not in a way that it actually incentivizes more illegal immigration, but that for the folks that are already here and are just trying to get by, we have a pathway to get them on the right track. And that's not a controversial opinion. Statistically, that's actually a very popular view, especially among evangelical Christians. Actually, a lot of Christians support, across the aisle, either side politically, support that as a potential option. Because the big thing for us is we want to keep families together. We need to fix the system, but we also need to be humane. We don't want to see families get ripped apart. I would bet money that some of the folks that come to this church, or go to any church, might be undocumented. Probably not a ton, but more than you'd think. Because you don't go walking around saying, oh yeah, I'm an illegal immigrant. You keep that to yourself. And so I know there's a lot of rhetoric thrown around, but these are also people most likely that you know and that are part of your everyday life. So we need a humane solution to fix this. There's one more point I was going to make. If I come back to it, I'll remember if I come back to it. So how can you personally get involved? You can donate, you can advocate, you can volunteer. If you want to keep up with what's going on, World Relief does, our national office, puts out press releases. We have position papers that we put out. Anytime anything comes out about immigration, usually not long after, we're going to have a press release about it. So if you're looking for a source that is biblically rooted, not overly biased one way or the other, that is rooted in data, I highly recommend that you check that out just to get another perspective. Another really good resource is the Evangelical Immigration Table. So you can also, if you just Google that, you'll find them as well. So World Relief has found that, and it's a coalition of Christian organizations that are involved in immigration work, and it's a similar deal. They do a lot of research, they come out with policy recommendations, they advocate on the government level on both sides of the aisle, and they do some great work as well. So there are, I know there's a lot of rhetoric being thrown around right now, a lot of divisive commentary about it, but there are good resources that you can trust if you're trying to be more well-informed about this issue. So that's all I've got. Thank you for having me. Does anyone have any questions?
You are a development coordinator. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that's a nice word for fundraising. But it's more than that. If I ask you, because I know Skip and Adele O's, I'm going to grab coffee with them next month. If you meet with me, I'm not going to immediately ask you to break out the checkbook. Like, yeah, I'm the fundraising guy. That's part of my job. But we also want the people that support us to have a relationship with our office, to be involved in the work. Like with Linda, for example, she used to do airport pickups. She used to take Afghan women, pick them up, and we had or take them to their graduation from their education class, or maybe she'd go and drop off education packets in the homes of Afghan women that are learning their ABCs. So from my job, kind of on the community engagement side, is to really get people to get connected to the work. Realize that the folks that you hear about in news headlines are ordinary, real people, and they live in our communities, and that you're not actually that detached from them as you think. So that's my job.
And I always thought that World Relief had to do with Afghans. And
Mhm.
when hearing you talk, it's
Yeah.
others.
So it depends on the office, right? So Sacramento, I would say our breakdown is 60 to 70% Afghan, 20 to 30% Ukrainian, and then if you throw in a mix of Slavic and Central Asian, former Soviet Union nationalities, it's the main. And then you get sprinkling of others, Congolese, Venezuelans, that kind of thing.
During more normal times, what kind of support are they given?
Yeah.
Financially?
Yeah.
This kind of-
So before everything went crazy, they were given what's called per capita funding. So the amount of initial welcome money they were given is proportionate to the size of their household. So that would be tricky, right? Because federal government bureaucracy, not always practical to everyday life. We always had a hard time housing couples or single people and very large families. So with larger families, they get more money, which means they can pay more rent. But there's only so many landlords that'll rent out to a place that's adequate for a family of 10 or 12, let's say. Then you get a couple, and collectively their welcome money is $800 something. Unless you're on Section 8, and even then, you can't get a studio for 1 month at $800 in Sacramento. So it's tough. It's just we always try to figure something out situation to situation, but yeah.
How long does that support go for?
Well, so financially, the welcome money is a one-time thing. They get the caseworker that stays with them for 90 days. We also, and a program we still have is extended case management. So sometimes with some cases, if we said, okay, well, they need more help because maybe there's medical needs, maybe there's some mental health issues, whatever, we can enroll them in a program that extends that for another 90 days. So there are some other long-term supports, but the standard is 90 days of casework support. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, how much do you think of skin color as being a problem? Because let's face it, the United States has never had a good relationship with someone who isn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from the back of, all the way to the pillars.
Yeah, I don't want to, I got to be very careful about what I say because I am representing my organization, but
Yeah.
diplomatically speaking, you're not wrong. There, if you look at, I was talking with one of our vice presidents of our national organization, and they're saying that historically, as bad as things are now, United States refugee admissions has never been truly based on where is the need the highest, as far as like what proportions of people are coming from which countries. And you know, part of that is because we do have to protect our national interests. That is true. But the reality is, and I know that was a big part of the Biden administration's focus on refugees specifically. Regardless of what you think of any of his other policy stuff, with refugee admissions, part of his administration's focus was to bring in refugees from countries that historically haven't been as populous in who gets to come to the United States as a refugee. Yes, ma'am.
So you said you recommended getting an immigration attorney if you were concerned about your status in deportation.
Mhm.
How do they go about that and who pays for it?
So they have to pay for it.
They have to pay for it?
Yeah. So the unfortunate thing is right now, most organizations that are offering either pro bono or reduced cost immigration law are very spread very thin. World Relief, for example, we have immigration attorneys. We do have that, but there's wait lists. And you go to any of the other resettlement agencies, same deal. A lot of the other nonprofits, they should get on those wait lists. If someone needs a consultation, they should. They should also be prepared to pay for a private practice attorney and get a consultation that way if they need representation. Yeah.
What is the posture of our congressmen from our area here? Are they supportive of your effort and to restore funding and support?
I don't know. I'm gonna be honest, I don't track politics. Since I've been out, I just don't like to deal with it too much. I mean, you could probably say just like generally along party lines, that's the general gist. But I would say that there is more support, and there is more bipartisan support for immigration reform than you'd think there is. So locally, I don't know. You'd have to reach out to, and that's a good advocacy thing. Like, you know, call your congressman's office and see what their status, what their opinions are on border reform or refugee admissions, that kind of thing. Because even though it's an executive power, Congress allocates the funding for those programs. So Congress still does have some influence on it. So that's also important.